Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for watching. Well, we have a couple of very important topics to take up. The first one, I should say, medical liability and venue shopping. But first, the Auditor General of the state of Pennsylvania is on the program. Boy, do we have some subjects to talk about. How about marijuana? How about criminal justice reform? All of that and more. Let's get to it.
This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers, a fast-paced, unrehearsed weekly discussion with and about the leaders who shape your world. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Well, as I think maybe not surprising, the governor of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Governor Wolf, has decided to send his lieutenant governor, John Fetterman, to all 67 counties to gauge the opinion of Pennsylvanians towards an important subject, the legalization of marijuana. Sitting across from me, recreational marijuana, I should say, is the Auditor General of the state of Pennsylvania, Eugene DePasquale. He's been on the program many times. General, it's always great to have you here. Welcome back.
No, thanks, Terry. Thanks for having me.
Well, I have more subjects than we have time to talk about, but let's get to the one that's been making the news. You earlier staked out a position on the legalization of recreational marijuana, and you make a couple of points, and I want you to tell our viewers about what you think it should be legal. Why?
That's right. A couple of things. Number one is my department, we did a report on this, and we found that if we just did simply what Colorado and some of the other states that have legalized it, if we did that, the state would bring in $581 million in new taxable revenue. That's number one. Number two, I just think it's a saner way to handle the issue. The war on drugs, let's be blunt, has failed. It has not worked. So I think we have to be smarter about how we approach this. Even when it comes to legalization, if we do this right, it actually can lead to reduction in teen usage if we do it right. Third thing is, we've seen states that have legalized it. It actually has led to a drop in opioid addiction. So there's multiple reasons why I think we should go down this path.
The other point that a lot of supporters make, and I have to be neutral in this program, but I'm just talking about their view, is that if it's regulated,
that's right,
not only will you get the revenue, that's the other side of it, but you'll also make sure that it's under control a bit.
That's right.
Instead of getting weed that may not be may be horrible for.
So if you have a store that's now selling it, they're licensed by the state, there's a health department, they're getting their appropriate licenses, just like when you buy a bottle of wine or beer, whether it be in whatever store in Pennsylvania, you have to show your ID to prove that you're 21.
Sure.
And so those same rules and regulations would apply to any sale of marijuana. Anyone that's intentionally violating that would be risking their license. I think that makes it so that it's less likely teens get access to this.
Yeah. All through my career as a college professor, the one thing that I regretted earlier on, let's say, and because of students and dealing with young folks, I wouldn't want to see somebody's career ruined because they get a couple of joints in their possession. I'm not suggesting that's a good thing to do. I'm merely saying
we've all made mistakes in life.
But who wants their whole career ruined because they get a record?
We've all made
right or wrong about that?
That's right. No, we've all made mistakes in life. But the idea that somebody's going to do something wrong with marijuana when they're 18, 19, 20 years old, now they can't be a teacher later on in life, they can't serve in the military. I've even seen correspondence from people that have been denied promotions in the military because of something they did in high school with marijuana. To me, that's just absurd.
I could not agree more. All right, let's switch. We have a number of important topics to talk about. In the last couple of weeks, we've done some programming here on criminal justice reform, particularly for people who've not had an offense for 10 years. What should happen to them? Can they get their record clean and get back and leading, I'll call it a normal life, whatever that is for any of us, right? So what's your sense?
I think the number one thing because we're doing another report on this as well, that we need to try to focus on is trying to reduce the amount of people that end up in prison. Now, that doesn't mean you don't punish people that make mistakes. We're talking about is trying to reduce that at the front end. The amount of money we spend on corrections, it's $50,000 per inmate per year. In our public education system, it's about $12,000 to $14,000 per student per year. The more we can save by getting people not to go down that path of prison, the more money is going to be available to invest in education. And there's really some simple steps we can do, and most of it revolves around trying to actually reduce drug addiction.
So specifically, does it mean looking at sentencing? Does it mean, as I just pointed out, you have somebody who's not committed a crime in 10 years, and what do we do with their record? I mean,
I think there's a couple of things. Certainly for non-violent offenses, looking at sentencing. But also there are people that are eligible for parole, but simply because the parole system is broken in Pennsylvania.
Right.
You know, they're literally sitting in prison for 5, 6, 7 months beyond when they could have been out, when everyone agrees they could have been out, simply because we don't have the ability to get them out on the street. So that's one where, like, whether you're a DA or the public defender, everyone agrees that there's a pretty big chunk of the Pennsylvania prison population that should be back out on the street and isn't because the parole system is broken.
All right, we're going to run to a break. I want to talk about another subject that you've investigated. It's called firearm violence and how to save lives. We'll get to that with the Auditor General after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association and Partners for Public Education, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
Well, the Auditor General has a report related to firearm safety in which he's outlined ways for Pennsylvanians to work within existing law, but to literally save lives. It's called A Safer Pennsylvania, a community approach to firearm safety. And sitting across from me is the Auditor General of the state of Pennsylvania, Eugene DePasquale. Do I got that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So go through some of these community, as you put, a community approach. You don't have to change the laws.
That's right.
Is that right?
One of the things we looked at is how can we try to reduce firearm deaths without changing one law?
Right.
And we know there's a debate about, additional restrictions, and that's a debate that the legislature and the governor can have. We try to look at within existing laws, how can we reduce firearm deaths? Number one, most people don't realize this, and that's not to say that the mass shootings aren't incredibly tragic and we should do everything we can to try to stop them, but 2/3 of gun deaths in Pennsylvania are suicide related. So one of the things—
Hold on. Repeat that. This is worth repeating.
2/3 of all firearm deaths in Pennsylvania
Wow.
are suicides.
Wow.
So one of the things we talk about is working with mental health experts, particularly in rural Pennsylvania where access to mental health is a challenge to get to.
Sure.
Working with gun store owners. Again, we had gun store owners come to us, and we actually have training with state police that's available and the Pennsylvania Game Commission available to help train gun store owners that if they see signs of mental illness or of irrational behavior when someone's going to purchase a weapon, they can try to delay that sale because there are signs to be picked up that, law enforcement will tell you that someone may be on the path of committing suicide.
Right. And what's interesting, you have some other things that we sort of take for granted, like safe storage, best practices, locking unloaded firearms.
Right.
I mean, it seems like some of this seems like just so much common sense.
Common sense. Again, we don't talk in there anything about mandatory, but we do talk about the Game Commission expanding their training programs to beyond just the hunting community to anyone that owns a firearm, so that they be eligible through the Game Commission to get some of these, I won't say tricks, it's tips on how to be safer with your weapon.
Yeah, that's a good point. But you also have some things that you think, for example, other law enforcement officials ought to do about concealed carry. Go ahead.
So we are concerned about, I think most people that pay attention to this issue are concerned about, is that this issue called straw purchases, where guns are sold illegally, again, something that's already illegal, but law enforcement has a struggle tracking it down. So what we talk about is when a ammunition or a weapon is used in a crime, giving the state police the tools, which other states have done, so that they can track it back to where the weapon was purchased from. And if it's multiple illegal purchases from the same gun store owner, now we know where the problem is.
Yeah. All right, a couple of, last topic before I let you go, a couple of state lawmakers, folks in the state legislature have been accused of discrimination, sexual assault, etc. Two of them in particular, the governor has called for them to resign. Similarly, you have weighed into this as well. So lay this out about what the dimensions are, and when you ask, after a charge is made, for somebody to resign, that's a pretty serious...
Yeah, so there are, look, anybody can level a charge, I get that, but, you know, I try to look at least in these two particular instances, how significant and serious are these charges, and do I believe that there's merit to it? And in these instances, I do, and I believe the lawmakers should resign. There's an overall point that needs to be made.
That's where I'm really heading.
Yeah, the culture of Harrisburg has to change, where the staff members, particularly the female staff members, are treated inhumanely by members of the legislature, and even sometimes.
And you were in there, so
I've seen it's unacceptable behavior, and the culture of Harrisburg has to change, where people that work for the legislature are hired or fired sometimes and promoted based on the merit of their work and nothing else.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I do think on one level, however, we have to ensure due process to make sure. I mean, I couldn't agree more with you. The culture has to change, and it can't be tolerated.
Right. And people certainly should have their due process legally, and even when it comes to how all four, legislative, the House, Senate, DNR, how they handle their own internal, committee assignments, et cetera. So there certainly should be due process there. But the overall message is the culture of Harrisburg and how staff members, particularly female staff members, are treated must change.
As always, I want to thank you. You're always welcome on a program. You'll come back. I know you'll have audits to reveal, and as you do make them public, you'll come back. All right, medical liability, venue shopping. You want to hang around for that.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Credit Union Association. Pennsylvania Credit Unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, check out ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties, representing the faculty and coaches who are devoted to providing quality public higher education for Pennsylvania's college students.
Well, welcome back. We got a huge issue, medical liability, venue shopping. It's an important subject, and joining me to talk about this is Dr. Danae Powers. She's the president of the Pennsylvania Medical Society, and Curt Schroder. He's the executive director of the Pennsylvania Coalition of Civil Justice Reform and a former member of the state legislature. Dr. Powers, let me start with you. Here's the situation. Currently now, if you have a liability claim, you file that claim in your county. That's the requirement. But there's the possibility that that could change, and where you could file could be broadened into other counties. Do I got that correct?
Correct.
So let me start with this. Why does this matter?
Well, there's a history to this. So we have a prior and a current experience, and it matters because there are some venues where juries traditionally will fall more toward the plaintiff or the defendant side.
Sure.
And people who want large verdicts will try to get a venue that tends to have juries that find in favor.
So it's venue shopping, is that the word?
Yeah, and it's in the end, it's about the size of the jury awards, but that percolates throughout the entire system. And we have had experience here in Pennsylvania in the past when venue shopping was allowed, and it had huge impacts on the healthcare delivery system.
Why does it? What's the involvement of the Pennsylvania Coalition of Civil Justice Reform, the organization you had?
Pennsylvania Coalition for Civil Justice Reform is a coalition made up of various healthcare members, employers, professional organizations, nonprofits, and we're very concerned about the proposal that's before the Civil Procedural Rules Committee of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which would reverse the venue reforms that were made in early 2003. As Dr. Powers said, you have to look at this in its historical context. Back in the early 2000s, Pennsylvania was in the grip of a medical malpractice crisis. You had specialists that were fleeing the state. You had family practices that were being squeezed out. You had maternity wards that were closing in the state. There were a number of reasons for the medical liability crisis that caused those things to happen, but one of the big problems identified was this issue of venue shopping.
Yeah.
In other words, if a surgery, something happened and it went wrong in Chester County, the plaintiff might file suit in Philadelphia County under the broad venue rules in effect at the time.
Likely to get a more favorable opinion. All right, so let's go to this. You're obviously, as a doctor, what does it mean to you?
Well, one of the facts of life as a physician is that lawsuits may happen. And in any given career, the studies have shown that up to over a third of physicians will get sued. And while certainly a patient who's been harmed because of liability deserves to be compensated and heard, there is a huge volume of these suits that are independent of something being done wrong. And it adds to both the professional trauma that a physician feels, it adds to the cost of delivering care, and it also can change practice patterns. So physicians might move into what's called defensive medicine mode, where they're ordering unnecessary tests or doing things that are clogging up the system that they wouldn't otherwise do. Raising the price, inconveniencing patients, and limiting access to other patients because you're kind of clogging the system. And what we want to do is make sure that that type of process doesn't come back. The other thing is we were seeing a huge decrease in the number of trainees who would stay in the state. Back then, only 4% of the physicians who trained in Pennsylvania were staying in Pennsylvania. So we were training doctors and exporting them to other states. So liability is a big concern.
Well, who should make this decision? You're a former lawmaker. Who should make it, and when will it get made?
Well, right now, the current rule, as we've said, requires that a medical malpractice case be filed only where the cause of action arose. In other words, where the alleged injury occurred. That makes sense. That has kept cases that previously were going to Philadelphia and some of the other big cities, which were notorious for their high jury awards and forced high settlements. It was keeping cases out of there and into the counties in which the injury occurred. So now a group of trial lawyers, those who bring these cases and are really searching for larger contingency fees is what this really comes down to. Now they're urging that the Supreme Court Civil Procedural Rules Committee revert back to the old venue rule, which caused the venue shopping that Dr. Powers described in the first place.
I got it. All right, we're going to run to a break. When we come back, there's something called prior authorization, and this is hugely important to both physicians and patients, and particularly to who's going to pay the bill and what the bill is going to. We're talking about the medical costs. You know, when you go in to see a doctor, you end up in a hospital. We'll get to that.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine. And by the Pennsylvania Healthcare Association, the future of long-term care.
All right, Dr. Powers, let's get right to it. There's been a dramatic increase in the requirements for prior authorization before, finish my sentence, before you can treat a patient, before
test
you can
a patient,
go ahead.
Get a drug for a patient, institute medical therapy for a patient, refer a patient to a specialist. Anything that can happen in the process of medical care outside of the initial visit to your primary care.
So prior authorization, who has to give the authorization?
It's the insurance company, the
insurance
payer.
companies to pay for it. Continue.
So here's what happens, and there's a reason why it was instituted. It was an attempt to control costs and utilization, which is a noble intention. But as in so many things, I say the pendulum has gone way too far in the direction, and now prior authorization is impeding care, limiting access, and causing harm to patients because of delay. So what happens is you go to see your physician, they feel that you need a test, they feel that you need to see a specialist, they feel you need a certain medication to treat what your medical condition is, to help you on the road to recovery and improved quality of life.
Yeah.
They can't order that. They have to go out to an insurance company. It ties up staff time for the doctor's office. It ties up the physician time. A lot of it's iterative, repetitive. So there's a question, a repeat, a denial. You got to keep going back. And in the end, patient care is being harmed. Physician time is being tied up.
Yeah.
And costs aren't delayed.
I have another question, but before I want to go to Curt. Is this a subject that when you were in the legislature? I don't remember this getting a lot of attention. And you would think that this is one issue where, given the patients, given doctors that that live in the districts that you all represented.
I recall back when I was in the legislature that the issue of prior authorization did receive some attention.
Yeah.
I don't know that we spent a lot of time on that issue. Back then, I left the legislature in 2012. But it certainly, is something that we're hearing more and more about today.
Yeah.
Well, I have an example. A mother in Middletown, Pennsylvania, her son is diagnosed with something called idiopathic juvenile arthritis. The doctor says this medicine will help him. For a month, she is on the phone every day with the insurance company, every business day, and then eventually takes off a day of work to spend 3 hours on the phone. And even with all of that, it takes 30 days for them to approve the drug for her child.
Is there some common sense approach? Obviously, prior authorization is necessary for some things, but not, as you say, well, you want to prescribe. And maybe it's this opioid concern about,
Well, the opioid, one of the big successes in Pennsylvania is we have actually removed prior authorization. We got 7 major insurers to agree to remove prior authorization for medication-assisted therapy for individuals who have opioid use disorder.
Yeah.
That's a huge thing. It's going to save lives. But we need to expand that concept of rolling back the prior authorization burden to other areas of healthcare for the patients and the physicians that are treating them in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and that's not, when you think about it, where does this all go? I mean, we're patients. Hey, Dr. Powers is a patient, right?
Right,
we're all
exactly.
Where do you think this goes?
Well, it's hard to tell. I mean, certainly patients have this concern, as does the medical community. And it's going to take, I think, a lot of discussion and a lot of education, educating the public and lawmakers in order to fully understand the problem.
Does your organization spend a lot of time talking with lawmakers? I would think
we do, and this is an issue for our members that has been important in the past.
Yeah.
And as with so many things, education is important. We're not saying do away with prior authorization. We're saying the system needs to be improved, and some of these roadblocks that are inappropriate need to be rolled back.
Right.
So we need to have a more rational approach to prior authorization.
Well, this is an extremely important topic. I mean, and it's one that fits right at the center of everybody's life. I mean, I want to thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
All right, we'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, stay well.